Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Once again, it's going to be a different one. I'm trying to do more of these. It's just need the time for it. And I think this is like second or third time I tried to sit down, and I've always had everything prepared, and then either there's construction outside or there's weird flickering with my lights because I've left it too late and there's no natural light left. So it's finally happening. And I thought it was high time that I filmed this. So as you've probably seen from the title of the video, I just want to talk about gauge swatches today. Not about how to do them or even necessarily what they are. It's kind of more just some of the reasons why I fell in love with them. Because when it comes to my knitting journey, if you will, and I am thinking about doing a video about it, kind of talking through in a bit more detail of where I started, what I started with, how I progressed, and how I got to where I am now, where there's very little I think I couldn't knit. I'm like, give me a challenge, throw it at me. But I didn't used to gauge swatch. I also didn't know what they were for quite a while. So I've got an example, which I've thrown on the ground again. For example, this is our Vesta Classic. So with your commercial yarns, you don't really get this with hand-dyed yarn, though I have seen it occasionally. You get this beautiful thing. So you get that incredible little thing which tells you what the typical gauge is that you can achieve with this yarn. So with 2.5 to 3 millimeter needles, which is what they recommend, you can get a gauge of between 28 to 32 stitches across and 36 to about 42 rows within a 10 by 10 centimeter square. And it just means that if you found a pattern, you're like, I love this, it's amazing. I have no idea what yarn to use because I can't get the yarn that they've recommended or they've used. You can then have a look at that suggested kind of gauge and kind of figure out it could maybe work. Now, there's no guarantee it will work and look good. That's a different thing. But it's just a handy thing to have. So I knew that existed on yarn. I didn't know what it meant. And then I think very slowly I was like, oh, it's something to do with you should have this many stitches and this many rows in 10 centimeters. Why is that important? And then eventually figured out after. I've never had a huge mishap with my knitting. I've been quite lucky. But I've had it occasionally that something's come out a little bit smaller than it's meant to, or a little bit bigger, but nothing where I'm like, I can't even wear this because it's so different. But yeah, and then I mainly I knew what swatching was, occasionally did it if I really thought something would potentially go wrong if I didn't. But I've always been the sort of person that if a specific, with the tension and the gauge and the needles recommended for a pattern, I've typically always just hit it. I measure it, my tension either after I finished or after I've worked a couple of centimeters. It's always just been fine. I've just been really lucky most of the time. And if it's been different, it's been minor that I haven't need to kind of frog a whole thing. And then I think it was with Sophie's videos, the Knit Purl girl, how much she loves swatching and all the swatches that she showed off. I was like, why can't I be like that? Why can't I be so well behaved and actually swatch before every project? And when it comes to gift knitting, I was always a lot better with that because I was like, if that doesn't fit, that's just kind of, I know how to fix things for me if they don't really fit the way I want them to. But as a gift knit, for someone who maybe doesn't knit and doesn't know how it all works, and then they maybe don't wear it because it doesn't fit the way they wanted it to and all these things, I swatched for those. And it really was with Sophie's kind of videos on her Instagram stories that I was like, I need to get into swatching. I need to be better. I just need to get over it, But, you know, there's no point, like at any point I could have it that I start knitting something and it just doesn't fit at all because I'm just completely off. And since I finished my PhD, I've become much more of a loose knitter. So now I can't even rely on, you know, kind of just using the needles that are recommended. Plus, it's so designer dependent because some designers are tight knitters. So then someone who's kind of a normal average tension can't use that needle size. Some designers are loose knitters, so it all depends. But so I've just got 7 kind of reasons, not just why you should gauge swatch, but why I've been loving it. Like, I have really fallen in love with it. So much so that sometimes I just enjoy the gauge swatching and then that's it. I just don't even do the project. It's just nice. Anyway. Number 1. The most obvious one, I think, is you just get to make sure the garment or whatever you're making is going to fit. It's going to come out exactly how the designer intended it. If you have a 100 centimeter bust, it means it's actually going to fit you with the ease that you wanted and all of that. You're going to get, literally it's the equivalent of being able to go into a shop going, yes, I'm normally a large, trying it on and going, yep, that is a standard large. It's like a gauge swatch is like you're trying your finished product on, sort of. Just means you're going to get the right fit. Like that is the main reason why you should gauge swatch. But for some reason, it's something where we're all like, oh, it's so boring and it's so tedious and such a waste of time. Just let me start the thing. I used to be like that. But it is something, you know, if you've experienced how awful it is when your tension is just completely different, completely off, and you get a garment that doesn't fit, swatching might have saved you. But sometimes, you know, it doesn't always work out. So that's number 1, the obvious one, the one that had to be stated first. Number 2 is probably, to be honest, they're all my favorite reasons. No, I have one reason which I like the most. But, you know, they're all kind of important and they're all... That's why they're in this list. Anyway, gauge swatching lets you check the fabric that you get and whether you like it. So, for example, I've got a pile of gauge swatches, which I'll show you later at the end. Let's go with what I'm wearing. This is the Crescendo blouse by Sophie the Knit Purl Girl, and I did a gauge swatch for it. I was like, I can't. With test knitting, I've also always been very well behaved and will do the gauge swatch. The only thing I'm really bad with, which you can see here, is I never gauge swatch in the round. I always do it flat. So my tension is roughly the same, actually, flat and worked in the round. My flat tension is maybe a little bit looser than my in the round tension. And because I'm a loose knitter anyway, if this kind of is a little bit looser than I want, I know in the round it will roughly be fine. Plus, sometimes you can't get gauge with the type of yarn you're using, no matter how much you change the needles and material and stuff. Sometimes you can't hit gauge and you just have to compromise. But the main thing that I also then check for, not just is the garment going to fit, is to check the fabric that I get. So the 2 yarns that I used for the Crescendo blouse are Sunday and Tin Silk Mohair by Sunday's Gun, which both of them I don't think I'd ever used before. Yeah, I don't think I had. So it was a way for me to check, do I like the yarn combo? Of course I did. Like, it's a classic now. As in, like, it's always been kind of a classic. People use it for a lot of designs. But it was also the fact that the 2 shades I got went the same. So a lot of the Sunday's Gun, you can find exactly the same color across the different types of yarn. But with this one, I went for 2 different greens. But I loved how it came out at the end. So I knitted up the swatch, was like, cool, the numbers are perfect. But then also I was like, oh, I like the drape that you get. I like the fluff that you get. It's not too see-through because the mohair kind of, you know, covers any holes you might get with the Sunday. And I was like, I love the fabric. It's so nice. But then you get cases where, for example, with this one, this is some 100% Corriedale from Yarn Home, I think they're called. They're based in, is it Lithuania or Latvia? I can't remember. I think it's Lithuania. They have an Etsy shop. So it's 100% Corriedale. I absolutely fell in love with the colour. I also have it in a green similar to this. And I wanted to make the Billy Pullover by Sari Nordland. And did the gauge swatch, which is done in moss stitch. And I don't even, you might be able to tell, like, it's not a square. It's not a perfect square. It's a rectangle. So I think my stitch gauge was too big. As in my stitches are too big. And my row gauge is too small. So I was like, maybe I can block it out. Doesn't work. It's a little bit forgiving with blocking. Like I could correct it a little bit, but this is just not correct at all. And it's also quite see-through, which I was not expecting. And because of the kind of like long hairs that this yarn has, I find the texture gets a bit dialed down and muted, which I don't want. I want the texture to pop because that's the whole point of the Billy Pullover. It's got cables everywhere. It's got the moss stitch. You want a yarn that lets the texture pop. And for me, this didn't do it. So not only are the numbers wrong, I also don't like what the finished garment would have looked like. So I knew I wouldn't have worn it. The like scratch of the yarn, the rustic feel doesn't bother me. But what the finished thing would have looked like based on what the swatch is looking like. So glad I didn't use this yarn for it. So I'll use it for something else. But yeah, so you kind of just get a feel for the fabric and can then figure out, is that what I want to knit? Because, okay, sure, this has lace here, but if you look at the sleeve, if I place this on top, I've got the same look out of my swatch as in the finished garment. And I should note the like line that runs across here is because I keep it in my notebook folded. So that wasn't there before. It's there because, well, I did this a long time ago. Last year even? Must have been last year. Yeah, so ignore that line. But yeah, the fabric you get. You just get to find out, is it going to work? Is it what I want? Number 3. So, you've done the gauge swatch and you love the fabric, but you didn't meet gauge. Well, not a problem. Well, I say not a problem. It can be a problem, but for example, I've got this swatch here, which is, I have no idea how you pronounce the yarn. Is it Cielo from Holskan? It's like an alpaca, fluffy sort of yarn. And I did a gauge swatch to try and see, could I make the Crescendo sweater by the Knit Purl Girl. And I think it calls for 7mm needles. And I was like, oh, well, I'm a loose knit, I'll go for 6.5. But then for some reason, I thought it was done in 6.5. So then I went to like a 6. And it's way too small. Came out much smaller than it was meant to for that sweater. But I like the fabric that you get. It's not too open, it's not too tight, and if I went up even to a 6.5, I might be able to meet gauge for that sweater, but I don't think I'd like the fabric anymore. And I love the look and feel of this. So what I can do now is either find a pattern that matches this gauge and knit that, knowing, ooh, pretty, I like it. Or I can use the gauge I've got here to calculate which size from the Crescendo sweater I'd need to knit to get my actual size. So I can kind of, calculate if I want to finish bust circumference of this size, I need this many stitches based on this gauge, and then look which size gets me the closest. There is a little bit of risk if you just do that and you don't change anything else, that neck openings and yoke depth and stuff won't work out, but you can always recalculate that as well if you feel confident with that. And I do, it doesn't bother me. So I haven't decided what I'm going to do yet, but I've got the swatch and I can always figure out later what I want to do with it. So you have that choice of then being able to kind of recalculate or find a different pattern with that gauge that you've got because you like the fabric. And I do think, from my point of view, it's more important that you like the finished fabric that you get than the gauge. Because if you don't like the fabric, like if it's too stiff or it's too open, you're not going to wear the finished thing. So you're getting the right measurements, but if you're not going to wear it because, you can see straight through it, or it feels like wearing, cardboard, what's the point? So then you either need to reconsider, the pattern that you're knitting, or maybe different yarn, or you could also, for example, if I wanted to, go up a needle size and then just hold some mohair with it, which I'm not going to do because I think it would then hide the loveliness of this yarn. But there are then options, and now I know what I could try and could do. Whereas before I would have just gone into it and then be like, my sweater is so much smaller than it's meant to be. So. Number 4. Another maybe obvious one, you get to try out different color combos. So first of all, there's the color combo of holding 2 different or multiple yarns together. For example, I spent a long time for the tulip sweater deciding what mohair to use with it. So it's 2 strands of Nutiden and a strand of mohair. And I spent ages, I think over a year, looking for mohair that would work. And no, this isn't a perfect match because it's got multiple colors in it. But I ended up loving it. And the swatch really confirmed to me, I was like, this is exactly what I want. It brings out the different colors of the Nutiden, and then it kind of makes it even more extreme because the mohair has so many different colors. And I was almost ready to give up. I was almost just going to swatch with the Nutiden. No mohair. I was like, I'm giving up. I'm not going to find any mohair. And I've finished the tulip sweater now, and I love the finished fabric. Then, for example, you can have... let's go for this one. I really want to make I think it's called Morello. Have I got it written down? Just so I can make sure I don't have it written down. Oh no, Moral Sweater. Not Morello, Moral Sweater by Lego from Fiber Tales. And it uses a single strand, I believe it's a single strand, of yarn by the Fiber Company, which I can get. But I was like, do I want to buy more yarn? Well, yes, but I shouldn't. I should try and use what I have as much as I can because I love the yarn that I own. So I had some Nutiden in my stash, which is this kind of white color that you can see. You can also really see how much Nutiden fluffs up when you've blocked it. It's amazing. It's unspun. And I was trying to decide, I was like, I can't hold Nutiden single and knit with it, especially not this color. It's just going to break. So I'm held it with a strand of mohair, which was still difficult to work with, but worth it in the end. And I had 2 different colors of Knitting for Olive mohair that I thought could work. And one of them was Putty, which is a bit more of a grey, like it's slightly cool tone white, which feels a bit odd to say. And then Cloud, which is a bit more of a pink white. And I looked at both of them because I didn't know what they looked like. The pictures online are really hard to tell, so I bought a skein of each of them. And originally I would have just bought Putty, and I would have regretted that so much because it didn't work at all. And then when I used Cloud, which I would have thought, oh, but that pink is going to bother me. I'm not much of a pink person. But it doesn't really show up. It's really hard to see. It's very blown out. But it just softens the white color and just makes it, I don't know, it's just, I think it's beautiful. I think gauge wise, yes, I measured it in my German video, I'm like 1 stitch off. So I either need to drop a needle size or pick a smaller size so that I get the perfect size at the end, because I do like this fabric, but I think even if I drop down a needle size, I think it could still work. So this is something I'm probably going to swatch again and just see how I feel, because the Nutiden fluffs up so much that you can't actually see through it. It's incredible. But yeah, so that was something where if I hadn't swatched, I would have bought the wrong mohair. Then you've also got this one, which I've shared before, which is 2 strands of Lana Grossa yarn held together. One is Eco Puno, which is a fingering yarn, and then yarn. And the mohair I bought was a fingering weight mohair. Now I can't remember, did I know at the time and was like, it will be fine, or did I just not realize? I can't remember, it's been so long. But when I swatched, normally because I'm a loose knit, I'd go down a needle size. I didn't this time because the yarn's thicker. And it worked out. So I was like, before I start playing around, should I go down a needle size, shouldn't I? I'm like, let's just see where we're at with the yarn weight I currently have. And it worked out perfectly. And it's given me such a fluffy and soft and filled out fabric that I think I wouldn't have had with a proper lace mohair. So this turned out way better than I thought it would. I love the color combo as well. But this is something where I almost, when I saw the 2 yarns and was kind of talking about it in a video, I was like, but it's not a lace weight mohair. I can't use this. I'll just have to go out and buy more mohair. Oh well, I'll have to deal. But now with the swatch, I'm like, no, I don't. This is so good. It's like a teddy bear. It's adorable. I love it. And once again, if I hadn't swatched, I would have spent a lot more money on yarn for probably then getting something that I wouldn't have been as happy with as with this. And then it's also, for example, for the test knit, I had the cone already at home for the whole super soft in this kind of really bright spring green and needed a mohair to go with it. And online, this Knitting for Olive one, which I think is dusty sea green, looked perfect. But then when I got it, I was like, this is a very different color to what I saw online. And I was like, it's not going to work. And I was almost like, screw it, I need to get started on this test and I'm just going to order more straight away. And I was like, Nina, even if you order it right now, it's not going to arrive straight away. So sit down, do the swatch and see how it turns out. And I love it. It's amazing. So I feel like with this one, it saved me a lot of money doing the gauge swatching. Number 5. Sort of continuing on from the swatch I just shared for this sweater, is sometimes you will get patterns which use something like Nutiden, Plöttelopi, and they're really hard to replace. So finding a substitute for those kind of yarns, if you either don't like wearing that yarn, can't get it, it's not affordable for you, whatever reason, if you want to replace it, it gets quite tricky. So I guess, for example, this one, the tulip sweater, 2 strands of Nutiden and a strand of mohair is what's recommended. But if you can't get Nutiden, you could use Plöttelopi, but then maybe that's not the kind of yarn you like using, and then I think it recommends a worsted weight yarn, but even with different types of Nutiden, sometimes the thickness will vary, and so it's just by swatching you can actually make sure that you're gonna be able to get the right fit and everything. So swatching for those kind of more unique yarns and very different yarns, I feel like it becomes even more important. And then, for example, if you use a pattern where something, perfectly normal and standard is recommended, but you want to use something different, like Nutiden, I feel like if you don't swatch, you're just asking for, problems and disaster will ensue, because trying to then unravel this, as in this yarn combo, if you started the sweater and then saw, oh, it's too big, it's a nightmare, because not only is the Nutiden hard to unravel, but the mohair as well, it just catches on everything. And because I'm using a single strand of Nutiden, it's so fragile, and trying to unravel this whole thing would just be awful if I'd started the sweater and was like, oh, it's too big. And now I can kind of make a decision about which size to knit and the fit that I want and all of that. So for those kind of more unique, different yarns, I think it becomes really important, especially because the type of, whether you've got woolen or worsted spun yarn, whether it's superwash, non-superwash, it really changes the finished product. Same thing if you choose to, if something asks for pure wool and you go for more a 50-50, wool and cotton, it changes things. Because, for example, I've got a swatch here which uses a yarn which is wool and 80% wool, 20% silk. And this is a 100% BFL. Like, weight-wise, it's very different. And that will also have an effect. So these are the two of the swatches I've got for the Love Magic dress. But I've been swatching, like, so many different yarns to try and figure out what I want the most. And while I love the stitches that you get here, I would have to go down a bit of a needle size because this is too big. But it's already quite dense and I'm like, I wouldn't want to go down. And it's a test knit, so I don't want to calculate anything. And it's also too heavy. So I think by the time you get to a full dress, this whole thing would just pull. And silk is strong, but it's still about will it be able to retain its shape or will it kind of get a bit more stretched out. So kind of helps as well with that. Number 6 is something a bit different when it comes to gauge swatching. I love knitting. I feel like, if you've been watching my videos, I think that's really obvious. It's an obsession at this point. If I could just knit all the time and do things to do with knitting and yarn, I would. Sadly, I have to do other things. But so sometimes when you've been knitting on really big projects, big sweaters, big shawls, if it's all like small needles, fingering weight, which I've had for a while, swatching has been such a nice break to not only get to work with, thicker yarn, thicker needles, but also just different yarn and yarn that has come into my life that I absolutely love. And I'm like, but I want to cast this on now and get a feel for it. You then just get to experience a different bit of knitting for a while because you might also, have a stitch pattern that you need to do, just moss stitch, but and it's just a break. And the biggest thing is sometimes you just need wins when it comes to knitting because you're just having a hard time finishing the project you're on. So having a small gauge swatch to do is then just really rewarding because, well, they're just done really quickly. And then you're just like, oh, not only did I do the good thing of actually making sure I've met, gauge, you've also then got a little something to be like, I did that. So when you're casting it off, I find it's just as satisfying as finishing anything else. So it's a small little knitting win. And then the final one, which I think is like my ultimate favorite reason and the reason I love gauge swatching and the reason I have so many now. I think other than, oh no, there's more. I think I might have 1 or 2 other swatches lying around somewhere, and 1 or 2 of these I did before I got to Germany, but most of these I've done over the last few weeks, really, is it prevents me from casting on all the time. Because, like I said, when I get a new yarn or find a pattern, I'm like, I want to know if it would work with this particular yarn I have in my stash. I can do that and do a little gauge swatch, and then at the end of it, I'm like, oh wow, yeah, it's going to be perfect. But that itch, that desire to cast on, which I have a lot, goes away. Because now I know what it's like to work with it, and I think that's normally what it is, at least for me. The reason I like starting new projects all the time is I want to change. I can have that with the swatch. I want to knit with that yarn. I get that with the swatch. I want to see what it's going to look like, how it's going to work up. I still get that with the swatch. So then I get that same satisfaction as having started a project, but I also get the satisfaction of having finished something, even though I then don't really do anything with these. But it just literally means I finish my swatch, block it. By the time it's dry and I've measured and I go, yep, that's going to be perfect, I don't need to cast it on straight away. And it builds up a bit more excitement for me to be like, but I know I can cast on later on when I want to. So I only did mini swatches for these two, but they're both Holst Coast. So wool with cotton. They're surprisingly, this one's so much softer. I don't know why. Here, I want to make the Friday tee by Petite Knit, so you can see it's got a bit more texture to it. And here I want to make the Yume like top by Isabel Kramer. Both of them I've decided to use the Holst Coast held double to make sure it's not too see-through, because it's quite a thin yarn. The Coast is even thinner than the Super Soft. But I had this Coast in my stash and I was like, I don't know what to use it for, because I think I've got 400 grams of this, 200 grams of this, and 200 grams of another color because the Friday tee has stripes. And I think it should be enough. But it now just means, oh, I know what I can do now with some of that. And the thing is, the different colors for the Coast don't really work up differently. It's not like the Nutiden or hand spun or something like that, where different colors and things can be quite different. With being a commercial yarn, it's quite consistent. So if I really like this, I then know I can get the same sort of gauge with a different color for a different pattern then, or for the same pattern if I want to make it again. I love it. Absolutely love it. I like these little baby swatches. They're so fun to make as well. So yeah, it prevents me from having too much on my needles. Now, I still have a lot on my needles because some of the projects are taking a really long time to finish, and with gift knitting, I let myself just cast those on so I can finish them as quickly as possible. So it still hasn't solved the problem, but it's going to, be a solution that will hopefully come into effect over this year. That hopefully by the time I finish this year, I won't have as much on my needles. And the fact that I'll also, get better fitting garments. Not that I've really had issues before, but even better fitting garments, get even better looking fabrics, because I'm not going to make the Billy pullover with this yarn now. It's going to become something else, and I'll find different yarn in my stash for the Billy pullover at some point. So yeah, so those are just some of the thoughts I've been having about swatching, and I know a lot of them probably were, you were probably sitting there going, well, duh, Nina, we all know that. But I hope maybe some of them helped you see swatching a bit differently. Maybe will also help you. I have had friends who've kind of said, when I said like it's prevented me from casting on a new project, they're like, I wouldn't do that for me. And I was like, well, that's what I thought until I started doing it. Because that initial desire is just, it's not completely gone and it's not completely satisfied, but it's pretty decent. And it then also just reminds me of like, when I'm about halfway through the swatch, I'm like, oh, you've got something else on your needles now, but I know I can finish it within a couple of minutes. Whereas when you start, the beginning of something that's like almost fingering weight, it's like you're excited and then you're like, oh, it's just going to get worse and worse if it's top down especially. And it's like, oh, it's just going to grow and it's going to be so much work and it's never going to come off my needles. And I don't mind having things on my needles, but it also means I don't focus on my project as much, and then things just sit around for a really long time, which I don't want anymore. So just some thoughts and ideas about swatching. And I might do another video like this in the future, because there's a couple of other things I've been thinking about with swatching, a bit more of the technical aspects, because I do sometimes feel like there's a bit of a, I don't know, a bit of confusion and some misunderstanding about swatching, but we'll see. But I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully, even if just one of you is like, you know what, let's get into swatching like Sophie did for me, that will make me more than happy. But thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in a future video soon, hopefully. Bye.